Alright guys, this week we are moving from the Mayans to the Aztecs. How exciting! School, learning, great! I know, you hate me for that. Setting the stage. While the Maya were developing their civilization to the south, other high cultures were evolving in central Mexico. And some of the most important developments took place in and around the Valley of Mexico. This valley, where modern Mexico City is located, eventually became the site of the greatest empire of Mesoamerica, the Aztec. So our learning targets here are, we want to understand that through alliances and conquest, the Aztecs created a powerful empire in Mexico. We also want to understand that this time period saw the origins of one of the 20th century's most populous cities, Mexico City. So the first major civilization of central Mexico was Teotihuacan, a city-state whose ruins lie just outside Mexico City. In the 1st century AD, villagers at this site began to plan and construct a monumental city, even larger than Monte Alban and Oaxaca. At its peak in the 6th century, Teotihuacan had a population between 150,000 and 200,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at that time. The heart of the city was a central avenue lined with more than 20 pyramids dedicated to various gods. The biggest of these was the giant Pyramid of the Sun. This imposing building stood more than 200 feet tall and measured close to 3,000 feet around its base. The people of Teotihuacan lived in apartment block buildings in the area around the central avenue. Teotihuacan became the center of a thriving trade network that extended far into Central America. The city's most valuable trade item was obsidian, which is a green or black volcanic glass found in the Valley of Mexico and used to make razor-sharp weapons. There's no evidence that Teotihuacan conquered its neighbors or tried to create an empire. However, evidence of art styles and religious beliefs from Teotihuacan have been found throughout Mesoamerica. After centuries of growth, the city abruptly declined. Historians believe this decline was due either to an invasion by outside forces or conflict among the city's ruling classes. Regardless of the causes, the city was virtually abandoned by 750. The vast ruins astonished later settlers in the area, who named the site Teotihuacan, which means City of the Gods. After the fall of Teotihuacan, no single culture dominated central Mexico for decades. Then around 900, a new people, the Toltecs, rose to power. For the next 3 centuries, the Toltecs ruled over the heart of Mexico from their capital at Tula. Like other Mesoamericans, they built pyramids and temples. They also carved tall pillars in the shape of armed warriors. In fact, the Toltecs were an extremely warlike people whose empire was based on conquest. They worshipped a fierce war god who demanded blood and human sacrifice from his followers. Sometime after 1000, a Toltec ruler named Topitzin tried to change the Toltec religion. He called on the Toltec people to end their practice of human sacrifice. He also encouraged them to worship a different god, Quetzalcoatl, or the feathered serpent. Followers of the war god rebelled, however, forcing him and his followers into exile on the Yucatan Peninsula. There, they greatly influenced late Mayan culture. After his exile, Toltec power began to decline, and by the early 1200s, their reign over the Valley of Mexico had ended. In time, Topitzin and Quetzalcoatl became one in the legends of the people of the Valley of Mexico. According to these legends, after his exile from Tula, the god traveled east, crossing the sea on a raft of snakes. He would return one day, bringing a new reign of light and peace. The story of Quetzalcoatl would come back to haunt the greatest empire of Mexico, the Aztecs. The Aztecs arrived in the Valley of Mexico around AD 1200. The valley contained a number of small city-states that had survived the collapse of Toltec rule. The Aztecs, who were then called the Mexica, were a poor, nomadic people from the harsh deserts of northern Mexico. Fierce and ambitious, they soon adapted to local ways, finding work as soldiers for hire to local rulers. According to one Aztec legend, the god of the sun and warfare, Huitzilopochtli, told them to found a city of their own. He said to look for a place where an eagle perched on the cactus, holding a snake in its mouth. They found such a place at a small island in Lake Texcoco, at the center of the valley. There, in 1325, they founded their city, which they named Tenochtitlan. Over the years, the Aztecs gradually increased in strength and number. In 1428, they joined with two other city-states, Texcoco and Tlacopan, to form the Triple Alliance. This alliance became the leading power in the Valley of Mexico and soon gained control over neighboring regions. By the early 1500s, it controlled a vast empire that covered some 80,000 square miles, stretching from central Mexico to the Atlantic and Pacific coasts and south into Oaxaca. This empire was divided into 38 provinces. It had an estimated population of between 5 and 15 million people. The Aztecs based their power on military conquest and the tribute they gained from their conquered subjects. The Aztecs generally exercised loose control over the empire, often letting local rulers govern their own regions. They did demand tribute, though, in the form of gold, maize, cacao beans, cotton, jade, and other products. If local rulers failed to pay tribute or offered any other kind of resistance, the Aztecs responded brutally. They destroyed the rebellious villages and captured or slaughtered the inhabitants. By the early 1500s, Tenochtitlan had become an extraordinary urban center. Much of the building up of the city, and some of its growth, were achieved under Montezuma I. With a population of between 200,000 and 400,000 people, it was larger than London or any other European capital of the time. Tenochtitlan remained on its original island site. To connect the island to the mainland, Aztec engineers built 3 raised roads, called causeways, over the water and marshland. Other smaller cities ringed the lake, creating a dense concentration of people in the Valley of Mexico. Streets and broad avenues connected the city center with outlying residential districts. The canals that intersected with these roadways allowed canoes to bring people directly into the city center. Canoes also brought goods from the farthest reaches of the empire to the economic heart of the city, the huge market of Tlaltealclo. Boy, that's the best shot that I have at pronouncing that, guys. I apologize. Visitors to the market also found a great deal of local agricultural produce on display, including avocados, beans, chili peppers, corn, squash, and tomatoes. Most of the fruits and vegetables sold at the market were grown on chinampas, farm plots built on the marshy fringes of the lake. These plots, sometimes called floating gardens, were extremely productive, providing the food needed for a huge urban population. At the center of the city was a massive walled complex filled with palaces, temples, and government buildings. The main structure in the complex was the Great Temple, capital G, capital T. This giant pyramid with twin temples at the top, one dedicated to the sun god and the other to the rain god, served as the center of Aztec religious life. Religion played a major role in Aztec society. Tenochtitlan contained hundreds of temples and religious structures dedicated to approximately 1,000 gods that the Aztecs worshipped. The Aztecs adopted many of these gods and religious practices related to them from other Mesoamerican peoples. For example, the Aztecs worshipped the Toltec god Quetzalcoatl in many forms. They saw him as the god of learning and books, the god of the wind, and a symbol of death and rebirth. The Aztecs pictured Quetzalcoatl not only as a feathered serpent, but also as a pale-skinned man with a beard. Aztec religious practices centered on elaborate public ceremonies designed to communicate with the gods and win their favor. At these ceremonies, priests made offerings to the gods and presented ritual dramas, songs, and dances featuring masked performers. The Aztec ceremonial calendar was full of religious festivals, which varied according to the god being honored. The most important rituals involved the sun god Huitzilopochtli. According to Aztec belief, Huitzilopochtli made the sun rise every day. When the sun set, he had to battle the forces of evil to get to the next day. To make sure that he was strong enough for this ordeal, he needed the nourishment of human blood. Without regular offerings of human blood, Huitzilopochtli would be too weak to fight. The sun would not rise, the world would be plunged into darkness, and all life would perish. For this reason, Aztec priests practiced human sacrifice on a massive scale. Each year, thousands of victims were led to the altar atop the Great Temple, where priests carved out their hearts using obsidian knives. Sacrificial victims included enslaved persons, criminals, and people offered as a tribute by conquered provinces. Prisoners of war, however, were the preferred victims. As a result, the priests required a steady supply of war captives. This in turn pushed the Aztec military to carry out new conquests. In fact, the Aztecs often went to war not to conquer new lands, but simply to capture prisoners for sacrifice. They even adapted their battle tactics to ensure that they took their opponents alive. In 1502, a new ruler, Montezuma II, was crowned emperor. Under Montezuma II, the Aztec Empire began to weaken. For nearly a century, the Aztecs had been demanding tribute and sacrificial victims from the provinces under their control. Now, with the population of Tenochtitlan growing ever greater, Montezuma II called for even more tribute and sacrifice. A number of provinces rose up against Aztec oppression. This began a period of unrest and rebellion, which the military struggled to put down. Over time, Montezuma II tried to lessen the pressure on the provinces. For example, he reduced the demand for tribute payment by cutting the number of officials in the Aztec government. But resentment continued to grow. Many Aztecs began to predict that terrible things were about to happen. They saw bad omens in every unusual occurrence. Lightning striking a temple in Tenochtitlan, or a partial eclipse of the sun, for example. The most worrying event, however, was the arrival of the Spanish. For many Aztecs, these fair-skinned, bearded strangers from across the sea brought to mind the legend of the return of Quetzalcoatl.